Welcome to the Rex Andrews Show. Glad to have you with us. If you are a first-time listener, got a few homework assignments for you. Number one, don't forget to subscribe wherever you are listening to the show. Two, don't forget to share it. The algorithms and the engines out there, they like it when you share, so that helps us. And then number three, today I have a caller on, so I'm not afraid to beg. I will be unbashful, and so I will beg for ratings. If you think we're doing a good job, give us those 5 stars. So thank you very much for joining the conversation today. All right, for those who are returning listeners, I just have one thing to say. Thank you very much. With over 2.4 million podcasts out there, with about 120 million episodes, there's a lot of content to listen to out there, a lot of choices. And so thank you for dialing in. We have a segment that I throw out each day to recognize our listeners who are coming in from all over the world. And I'd like to welcome the listeners in Cape Town, South Africa. It's glad to have you on and listening to the program with us. We're excited and thankful. We are now listened to in 32 countries, in over 500 cities on 6 continents. And if I could figure out how to market to those pesky penguins and then also help them recharge their cell phones, we'd probably have listeners on that last continent. All right, well, let's get on with it. I have one last housekeeping item to remind you of. Please stop by the show website, rexandrewsshow.com. The reason I ask you to do that is for one reason. We introduce and interview really amazing people doing great things, and we try to cover a lot, but we can't get to all the stuff about them. And so most of the time we are just scratching the tip of the iceberg. So stop by the show website, look up our guests today, all of our guests, and even our upcoming guests. There's about 50 or so in the upcoming queue. So there's always interesting people to check out. So do stop by the show website. All right. Thanks for all that house cleaning and your patience with that. All right, we've got a great show today. I'm excited about this story to tell you today. I think it's amazing. The story that we share with people are the human experience, the stories that make us real. It's not out there in the ether where things are not real. We talk about things that are real. So in our biography today, I'm excited to talk about this gentleman. Number one, he is a father, and that's one of the most important roles any man can play. And now I'm learning how to be a grandfather too. So it's a great step in that progression. He's a husband, and that's just as important. Leader in his family. He's an author, about ready to release an ebook. So got some exciting things to talk about that. He is a peer. He is a podcaster. So I always like to talk to podcasters because you know what? I don't have to pull words out of them. And so that's a good thing. I want to ask him about this one. He is a relationship generator. I've not heard that term before. So it'll be interesting to talk about that. And a former pastor. And he's got an amazing story of some recovery and some things and some obstacles in his life that he's overcome. So I'd like to introduce to you this morning, Mike Hatch. Mike, how are you?
I'm great, Rex, man. Thank you so much for having me on. It is a pleasure to be with you, man.
Fantastic. Thank you. Now, what corner of the world are you dialing in from today?
Yeah, so I am in the black and gold region of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Oh, I love Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's one of my favorite towns. I just, what's the funny thing about Pittsburgh is it's overlooked by many people.
Yes,
you have the folks on the East Coast there that it's all you ever hear is the Boston down to DC corridor and all that kind of good stuff. And then you hop over and then you've got a lot of people just fly over the Pittsburghs and the Clevelands and some of those towns and Syracuse and some of the places. Yeah. Then people recognize Chicago, right? And
then Chicago's big. Yeah,
Chicago's big. But Pittsburgh's one of those cities that I just don't think it gets enough accolades. So glad to have you on. And I'll have to admit, now I'm a diehard Broncos fan and grew up here in Colorado.
Oh, yes. Okay.
I am dyed in the orange and blue. But as a kid, I used to think I was Mean Joe Green in the backyard. And so I followed the Steelers in the heydays of the 4 Super Bowl championships right in that grouping. And back in those days.
You'd be surprised how many people I talk to who in your generation have said that many times that they've there's a good buddy of mine in Chicago during the time when the Bears were not very good, but the
Yeah,
Steelers were fantastic, and he
exactly.
picked them up, and to this day is
Yep.
still a Steeler fan. So
Yeah, I remember when the Broncos and Pittsburgh played in the AFC Championship game, and I had a chance to go to the game. And while I just nearly cried that we got beat and destroyed that day,
that was Jake
I
Plummer, right?
yeah, I was Jake
Okay,
Plummer.
yeah.
I was okay with it. I could live with the fact, and I could swallow the fact that it was at least the Pittsburgh Steelers that beat us. If it had been those
Yeah.
pesky New England Patriots, I probably would not have even been able to get out of the stadium. So.
That was the year of destiny, man, when Jerome Bettis was destined to make it back to his home city of Detroit for the Super Bowl, right? And
Yeah, it
it just
was.
seemed like nothing was going to stop the Steelers that year.
Yeah, that was great. No, a fine organization, great family, good people, and for those who are football heads, I've always admired them, even though we're a little more Bronco fans these days. Well, I've been a Bronco fan forever. All right, so we've got a great program when we showcase people, and today I want to showcase your story. Success doesn't fall out of the sky, and I tell that people to all the time. One of the purposes and missions behind my show is to help people understand the journey that it takes to have success. I have known all kinds of very successful people, but overnight success is kind of a decade thing sometimes, even on one endeavor. And
Yep.
so I like to have people understand the journeys and the inputs and stuff. So let's go back in time, and I'm going to throw out a list. It's a long list, but we'll go through these things and give you a little chance to prep here. We want to know where you were born. Okay. So, there, and then also where you were raised, which can be very different. I had a guest on the show, Ellie Soja, who moved 63 times before she was 15. So a huge influence of, environment there.
Yeah.
We also want to know, what did you do as a kid growing up when you weren't in school? So you into sports or, reading, drama, music, theater, computers, shoplifting. And I throw that one out there because don't laugh. I actually had a guest, Larry Cole, by the age of 15 was a car thief. So interesting things he was focused on at that point in time.
Right.
Then we want to know a little bit about your family. And so do you have siblings? If you have siblings that survived your harassment. We also want to know about your parents. Now, parental influence is so huge on who we are. And in all the hundreds of interviews that I've done over my radio and then this podcasting career, I find that there's really three buckets. I kind of throw them into these three buckets. The first bucket is the super supportive, fully engaged, launch pad parents. They're just, pushing people to, the kids to go to the next level, do great things. Then there's some sort of the middle bucket, which is the somewhat I call non-participatory, where the parents love their kids, supported their kids, but they were so busy eking out a living that they just didn't have, all the resources to really just launch them. And then the last bucket I don't like very much, but it's a very influential bucket. I call it the struggle bucket. And that's generally where there's extreme types of situations where there's abuse possibly, or extreme poverty, or just strife, emotional trauma, all those types of things. And it motivates kids to say, hey, you know what? I don't want to be anything like that. And so I wouldn't say everybody fits exactly in every bucket, but there's those three buckets kind of are there. So we want to talk about a little bit. Also want to understand about your education. All right. So, where you went along the way, and then some hopscotches with your life and your career. But mainly I'm looking for pivot points. When were these pivotal times that you do that? And then I know you have some interesting story on some stuff you've overcome. So let's go back in time, and don't worry about that list. I know it's long. I'll ask some questions. Just you throw them out. So let's go back in time, Mike. And where were you born?
Yeah. So I was born in Wheeling, West Virginia.
Okay.
So that's the panhandle of West Virginia. If you think about the state, if you know that the shape of it is, there's panhandle that kind of juts up right in between Ohio and Pennsylvania. So I was born there, but ended up spending the first kind of couple years of my life in St. Clairsville, Ohio, which is very close, hop, skip, and a jump over the border. And then we did move around a little bit. So, or I did, I know, but my family did a little bit. We moved from Ohio to Pittsburgh, the South Hills of Pittsburgh.
Okay.
Probably for the first 10 or 12 years of my life. And then we moved from there back to St. Clairsville, Ohio again. And that I lived there until I had graduated high school. While I was in high school, unfortunately, my parents divorced. That's part of my story. I'm sure we'll get
Okay.
to. And then after my parents' divorce, I moved back to Pittsburgh, the West Hills of Pittsburgh, with my father and my brother. Once my father remarried my stepmom, so
Okay.
kind of a yeah, and that's where I went to college. I'm wearing the hat actually, Robert Morris University. I
Yep.
love that college, and that's where I went to school in the West Hills near the airport in the West Hills of Pittsburgh. So yeah, kind of jumped around a little bit. Even when we lived in Pittsburgh, I think we moved probably 4 times.
Wow.
So yeah,
What type of employment did your parents do when you were growing up?
yeah, that was the interesting part. So, well, my father was a pretty influential radio and television talk show host here in Pittsburgh
Wow.
locally. And yeah, very well known here. He had the that coveted afternoon drive radio spot. Had a late night television show locally that kind of resembled some of the late night shows you might see that were by David Letterman or folks
Sure.
like that. And so it was very interesting. Now I also grew up in a Christian family, and so these shows were faith based in nature. But it was still very interesting just to grow up in that environment. Sometimes being out at restaurants in public and people recognizing my family or my dad, and yeah, it was an interesting time. So my parents both were kind of involved in the ministry like that, and in those shows to some extent. Um, but then actually, so my father suffered a massive heart attack when we were camping in the Appalachian Plateau. We're in the middle of nowhere,
Right.
and he was a smoker, and he basically caught up to him, and they had to actually we actually blazed this trail into our camp where we would stay on this piece of land that we owned, that my parents bought. And the only way in and out was using either walking or taking this tractor that my dad had with a flatbed on the back of it. And so they wrapped him in sleeping bags, put him on the flatbed of the tractor, and drove him out on the tractor. And if you've ever been into the Appalachian Mountains of Pittsburgh, the Pennsylvania area, it's very rocky.
Yeah.
And so my father was just bouncing up and down on the trailer as they took him out and put him in the van and took him to the hospital, rushed him to the hospital. And they actually said that may have saved his life, almost acting as if it was almost like a defibrillator, where it was like,
Wow.
yeah. So it was really interesting. But yeah, so it was a crazy moment that and then that ultimately led to, because it wasn't just the smoking, there was a lot of stress involved with what he was doing.
Sure.
And so that really was I guess a watershed moment that where he ended up leaving that career. And then my parents kind of jumped around to all sorts of different things. My dad still dabbled a little bit in radio here and there with production and stuff, but that kind of ended that career for him for the most part. So
Well,
yeah.
the one thing a lot of people don't realize, if you're on the radio is not the highest paying employment.
That's right.
It's a
That's right.
misnomer. It's like, are you paid with applause or dollars? Well, okay, that's kind of how you look at that industry. I did a radio program for a while here in Denver, and it was funny. I know what it's like to be recognized. Now, I didn't have any video, so it was 100% radio. And I would be out in stores and people would recognize my voice.
Yes. Same thing happened to my dad sometimes.
And I'd be like, and I would want to hide and deny it, but I wasn't going to lie to him.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, no, I know that. But no, it's not as glamorous as people think. I mean, in the pay, unless you're in the really big, major markets with huge budgets or national syndicated show, radio just isn't that high paying employment. It just isn't.
Yeah. There's a trade-off there sometimes with being famous or more well-known, if you will.
Yeah.
For the lack of payment or compensation for it. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So what did you do as a kid? What were your interests outside of school?
Oh man. So I was, well, number one, and this is actually key to understand about my story. I was a terrible student.
Okay.
I mean, horrible. Not like, well, okay, maybe I'm exaggerating. I don't mean like F's, failing constantly. I made it. I was never held back or anything, but just very C average, um, and kind of maintained that throughout my school year. I just didn't. School wasn't made for me. Let's put
Were
it that way.
I
Yeah.
understand. I get that a lot. Were you bored with it, or what was?
No, actually, I was overwhelmed.
Okay.
So in my family, my dad being the big personality that he was, I also had a grandfather who was a rags to riches story in the Ohio Valley with the coal mine. He played a huge role. He was vice president of Consol Coal Company,
Okay.
and so one of the biggest in the country. And so he but played a huge role in helping to spearhead new safety initiatives for coal miners,
Okay.
and so people just knew my grandfather really well. The whole community loved them, and my uncle was a vice president of Mobil Oil, in charge of the Asian quarter of the globe. So these huge male personalities that
Okay.
just makes, you know what I mean. So I just felt
Yep.
like I had this pressure to measure up, and or yeah, to that standard. And some of it was just me putting pressure on myself, but as a result of that pressure I put on myself, it left me paralyzed in some sense. So I was always someone who struggled with procrastination because I couldn't ever get myself started, because of the fear of failure or not measuring up, just this weight and pressure I had on me. So that, I think that played into it big time in terms of school and
Okay.
my lack of performance. Yeah.
So outside of school, I mean, you said that you weren't a
Mhm.
great student, and no problem with that.
Yeah.
Our government school systems, which I have come to call them, isn't designed for everybody.
Right.
So, what did you do outside of school? What were your interests?
Yeah. So I was a man from an early age, a diehard Steeler fan. I remember I loved football to this day. I mean, bring a football and we'll go throw football in the yard or in the street or something. That I love it. There's nothing,
Yep.
not too much I love doing physically more than that. But so I grew up, watching the Steelers, watching football. I used to take my grandma would do the laundry, and she would have freshly folded washcloths, and I'd take these washcloths and I'd stuff them under my shirt by my over my shoulder, to act as shoulder pads, and I'd reenact different plays that I would see, watching football, and I'd be the quarterback. I'd throw myself the ball as the receiver, and
Yeah,
then I'd get tackled by the pretend defense cornerback or whatever.
that's
Yeah.
right. Right. Right.
So yeah, absolutely loved football. And art was a big deal for me too.
Okay.
I was fairly creative and loved drawing. I'm actually left-handed. I know, not for those of you who are left-handed, I'm with you, and I know you can relate to being in your right mind.
Mm-hmm.
That's a knee slapper. So yeah, so I'm left-handed, and that provides me a lot of creativity, a lot of challenges along the way with that. But then I throw, and I'm at my right hand is my athletic hand, so I throw with my right hand. But I used to love drawing and painting and all sorts of different. Art was always one of my favorite subjects, and gym, of course, getting
Yeah.
to run around. Yeah,
Now, do you have siblings?
I do. I was the oldest. I've got a younger brother and a younger sister. Each of us are 2 years apart.
Okay.
And so, yeah. And then actually when my father remarried, they had another daughter who is about 19 years younger than me. So
Oh,
that was
wow.
yeah, it was a whole nother,
Whole nother dynamic. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. A whole nother dynamic. But that's another piece to the puzzle for me too, is being the oldest. Aside from feeling like I needed to measure up to these big personalities, I always felt this weight of responsibility. Especially when my parents divorced, I felt like it was up to me to kind of hold the family together in a sense,
How old are you when your parents divorced?
Yeah, I was 16, about 16
Okay.
years old, the summer of my 16 year. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that's just flirting with being an adult, So
Yeah. Yeah, but also very you're as we know through neuroscience and all this kind of stuff now recently, just your brain is still so
Oh yeah.
so developing, and it was very traumatic for sure because
Yeah. Yeah, those ages of 15 to 18, 19, you're trapped somewhere between a boy and a man. I mean,
yeah,
that's just in that transition period. So
definitely.
yeah, so okay, wow. So that's probably pretty big impact on you. Now, are you fairly close with your siblings?
I'm close with my brother,
Okay.
not as much with my sisters. Um, and yeah, so my brother and I, and that's the hard man. So when divorce happens, the whole family fractures, and everybody kind of tries to figure out where their safe place is, what relationships are safe and not. And unfortunately, it makes it really difficult to sometimes maintain some of those relationships
Mm-hmm.
because for whatever reason, someone in the family doesn't perceive someone else as being safe, or they don't trust them, and so it gets really messy. So yeah, those relationships with my family have been very strained, unfortunately, as a result of that.
Okay. So when I talk to people about bucket stuff, the three buckets I talked about,
Yeah,
obviously there's a fracture at some point in time. So there was a struggle that was created.
yeah.
Would you classify my silly little three buckets? Which one of those might have been in prior to the divorce?
Remind me again, three buckets again.
So the first one's a super supportive launch, type
Oh yeah,
stuff. Then there's the in the middle sort of non-participatory because they're so busy working their tails off to provide for their kids. And then the
yeah,
last one is the stress and struggle where it was an environment nobody wanted to be around.
yeah. Okay. So that's really it's really helpful to think about that. At the same time, I, I'm tempted to say it was a combination of all of them
Okay,
in
yeah.
in this sense, and I'm not trying to kind of sidestep the question, but
Right.
in the first bucket, I like being growing up in a Christian home. I just had such a unique, how do I say this? They taught me very early on about the importance of faith,
Hmm.
um, of God and His influence in my life, of what the difference between right and wrong, um, truth and lies, um, and so that was one of the greatest gifts I could ever receive from my family, and that if there's nothing else, because they have given me so much more, but if there's nothing else, that was such a huge platform for me that just carried me through my entire life,
Hmm.
um, and helped me a ton as I progressed. So the middle bucket, there were times, my dad. One of the jobs my dad transitioned into was being a truck driver
Oh, wow.
to provide for the family during some hard financial times, and so he was gone a lot as a result of that, and was out on the road. He did get to take me out one time, which was kind of fun. I got to go on a trip with him to California and then back again, and that was eye opening because man, it is impossible to sleep in the back of those big rigs. Oh
Oh,
my
yeah.
gosh, it is crazy. But yeah, so he was gone a lot there, and then just based on some of the conflict that my parents had, especially previous to the divorce, the only way I can say it is that they were so consumed with kind of protecting their own hearts and trying to survive what they were going through that they weren't as emotionally available to me
Right, right.
and my brothers and sisters. And then unfortunately, as a result of that, the third bucket, I would say, yeah, there were some times where there was some, I would call it abuse, I guess.
Hmm.
Um, and let me preface this by saying that like I've personally come to terms with all of that and have nothing but love and compassion and just a grateful heart for my parents and what they did for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, unfortunately, that played out as well in our
No, I totally
family.
understand that. I come from some similar backgrounds. My dad, for a period of time, drove truck. It was to
Hmm.
make ends meet,
Yeah,
and I got to go on one trip with him.
no way.
Yeah, kind
Ha.
of thing. Sing, and it was career day. Not that I wanted to be a truck driver, but it was like be away from
Yeah.
school for a week. Woohoo! But I also
That's great.
understand. I also understand. Today's definition of abuse is much different than it was when a generation or two back, and
Yeah.
so things that our parents might have done. would be considered atrocious by today's standards. And yet,
That's a good point.
when my father passed away 7 years ago, before that, long before that, probably even 10 years before that, I had reconciled all of those things. And
Mm.
life doesn't come with an instruction book, and parenting
Mm.
doesn't come with an instruction book. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, there were some rotten things. I understand some of that. And so, yeah, sometimes it would be verbal. Sometimes it would just be almost like an abuse environment of expectations and those types of things. And
Yep.
yeah, there was some physical times too. So, like my dad would get fired up and he'd come after us and stuff. So, but it's different today. But
Mhm.
I don't want to say that's a healthy situation, because a lot of people carry that kind of struggle with them for the rest of their lives. But it is an
Yeah.
influencer, but it also helps. It's kind of the refiner's fire. It helps
Yeah.
us sharpen things a little bit. So definitely understand. All right. Well,
Yeah.
so when you finished up with school, did you go right over onto the university, or did you take some time off, or what was your next hop?
Yeah, I did. So it was instilled in me from an early age that college is the most important thing. My mind has changed on that since, by the way.
Yeah, mine
But
too.
yeah, but but here's the thing though. So this is so funny. Nobody would accept me. I mean, I wasn't the student that like colleges would accept. So really, that's the other part. The other reason why I kind of love Robert Morris, the university I did go to. They were one of the only ones who took a chance on me,
Wow.
and took me in, and man, it made a huge difference. It really did. Just knowing that a university would believe in me, and had a great experience there. Learned a lot, grew in my faith, and I had a chance to run. I ran track at Robert Morris. Again, just kind of naturally athletic to some extent. So I, ran the 400-meter hurdles and really enjoyed that. But yeah, college was was that a formative time too, because that was when I decided to move out and live with a buddy of mine in an apartment together. And that was part of that too is some of the, when my father remarried, and because of some of the dynamics that happened leading up to the divorce, it just and it those of you who've experienced divorce and a blended family can probably understand this, but I just it felt wrong in some sense. Like this is not the way it was supposed to be. Um, as as I'm trying to figure things out in my mind, um, in terms of what happened with my parents and their marriage falling apart, and now this new woman who's taking on a mother role in my life. It just and she and I really had a hard time getting along. My stepmom and I did not hit it off well, and so eventually I just decided to move out and start on my own, which kind of was another theme for me. One of the messages I think I got, or that I received from my parents, and that was kind of a recurring thing in my life, was that, hey, Mike, you're on your own. You can't depend on your parents. You can't depend on whoever. Like it's up to you.
Right.
And so that was part of my motivation for moving out. I think was, here we go. I just gotta do it on my own, basically.
Yeah. I can relate to that a little bit. My dad was a law enforcement for my entire
Mm,
time growing up,
yeah.
until he had that spot in trucking for a little bit. But from the time I was the smallest kid, he was always like, "Hey, I may not come home today, and you
Mm.
need to be." And I was the oldest boy, and so you need to be a
Oh,
man, and you need to be able to prepare to live on your own. That's a
yes.
heavy burden when you're a kid, right?
Yeah, and they
But
don't realize necessarily they're putting that burden on you, but
no, they
it
don't.
does translate though.
It does translate, and
Yeah.
I literally left home at 17, and that was it. I mean,
Wow.
I graduated from high school, and wasn't going to be 18 till late in the summer, and left, and that was it. I was just like
Wow.
you. I just time to take off, and so yeah, I
Yeah.
understand that emotion. So,
Mm.
looking back, what was the best part of your experience at RMU?
Mm. That's a great question. I think was first of all, the running track was a great experience. But then, something else I guess I didn't mention, here's kind of a pivot, as you've talked about before, was so after my sophomore year, I decided to join the military. And so I enlisted with the Air Force. There's a base out here in Pittsburgh, the 171st Air Refueling Wing, and they have KC-135s, which are the big Boeing 707s, air refuelers with a kind of a boom rod that comes out of the back and refuels other jets. And so I joined the Air Force, partly for money for college, partly also I was very interested in serving my country. And so that was an incredible, oh my gosh, life-changing experience. I mean, there's nothing like going through basic training to especially as a boy growing up to be a man, if you will. That really taught me how when we talk about discipline in the military, here's what it boils down to me, because you hear people talk about this all the time. The military taught me discipline.
Right.
For me, what that meant was doing the hard things when I don't feel like doing them, basically. Prior to that, like I said, I was very fear driven. And so, procrastinating, putting things off, not wanting to engage in doing difficult things, that really changed my perspective and taught me that, no, I can actually, when you engage in doing these hard things, you're not always going to be a success. You're going to fail often, but man, the learning process as you go through it is incredible. And so it really taught me to embrace that process. And so that was probably one of the greatest, I would say, when I think of, Robert Morris and my college years. The Air Force was a hugely positive experience for me.
I bet. So now, how many years did you stay in the service then?
Yeah, I was in for 6 years.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, I didn't say this before. So I finished basic training the summer of 2001.
Oh, okay.
So for those of you who remember that date, that following September, guess what happened? 9/11.
9/11, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that was, oh my goodness, like that further for me affirmed my decision to join, because then I'm like, well, heck yeah, now we're in it. Like let's do this.
Let's go.
Yeah, and then went to tech school that following winter, and so that just man, did that pour a lot more meaning into my service for sure.
Wow. Well, I appreciate your service. I appreciate that. My dad was in the 82nd Airborne in the Army. Yeah,
that's legendary.
And his line to us, because he was a paratrooper instructor, and his line to us as kids was, "Listen, son, I have jumped out of planes and I have thrown people out of planes, and you could be next." And so
that's great. That's fantastic.
Had that little fear running around the back of the head. Hey, this guy threw people out of airplanes mercilessly, and he would tell stories of, kids on their first jump and having really throw them out the door. So,
little bit of crazy sometimes there in military service.
That's right. So what was your next pivot? Now, how old were you when you got married?
Yeah, so I was 24 when I got married, and that would be, oh my gosh, man, that would be the next big pivot for me. So a big part of my story is an addiction to pornography that I struggled with from an early age.
Okay.
And it was really the place where I went to escape from the harsh realities of life that I didn't have the emotional tools to deal with, especially as a kid.
Right.
And it was I also, again, feeling like I had to be self-sufficient, feeling like it was up to me. It meant that my needs weren't going to be met. And so it was one of the ways that I went to in some ways have my needs met. Even, and it's funny because it's at a deep emotional level that you're looking for it, that just plays out in a sexualized way. Yeah. The other piece of it too that I didn't mention that played into this whole too, as I set the stage here, was I was sexually abused as a child by a babysitter, and that really affected how I viewed sexuality and women. I mean, it kind of, the way I say is it messed up the wiring in my head to where it just, so much of the world ended up, I don't know how else to say it, but just being sexualized. And I began to not be able to look at women as human beings, but as more like sexual objects, like people have heard before. That being said, that was me. And that caused a lot of shame associated with that, which meant I would hide that. I would hide that struggle in me. So even though, for example, I was really serious about my faith in God, and I even served in our youth group in some very big ways in our church, I began to live this duplicitous life where on one side, I look great to everybody. I got really good at earning people's approval of me because, man, did I need that desperately.
Right.
But yet I had this dark side on the other side that I was really struggling with, and couldn't figure out how to get free of it, driven by shame. Again, just what I call hiding in the dark, as opposed to living in the light, where, when we're in the light, we're exposed. You can see us, you can see our situation. I kept things in the dark. And unfortunately, that exploded in my face with my fiance and I. We were engaged, and it was about 4 or 5 months before we were married, our wedding. And we had gotten an apartment that I was living in, and she was living with some friends of ours. We wanted to hold off living together until we got married. And so unfortunately, that gave me all sorts of time alone with the computer and internet, and just a doorway to whatever I wanted to partake in.
Yeah. All
Again,
kinds of easy access.
Easy, free access.
Now, let me ask and stop you there for a second. How old were you when you first started partaking in pornography?
Yeah, I was about, I would say, 12 years old.
12 years old. So that's pre-internet then. So that was a little more effort, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that was and guys in our generation can relate to this, but I didn't actually find the Playboy or the Penthouse that a lot of guys do sometimes, but for me, it was my mom's Victoria's Secret magazine that would come in the mail. Or the Venus swimsuit issues, that kind of stuff that really lit that lustful fire inside of my heart.
Okay. Yep. Through our church and things, I've had experience with helping people identify and deal with and the addiction. Yeah. It's a terrible, terrible thing. Were you somewhat typical in like saying, well, I've got this under control?
Oh, at first, yes. Okay. Especially in high school.
Okay.
I would say in college, I began to think, okay, something's wrong.
Okay.
I am way too, it just got really dark and really desperate. So like it was either the magazines, or I would, and the other magazines I would, as I got into college and beyond, was Maxim magazine, Stuff magazine, some of these magazines that have some might call it soft core porn.
Yeah.
And, or at that time I would go to the video rental store.
Okay.
And get really good at figuring out the ratings, which rated R movies were just enough. Cause I was struggling with shame. So I didn't want to cross over to that, actual pornography, if you want to call it.
Right.
And so I stuck with that kind of softcore stuff, but it's so amazing how much time was taken up just obsessing about it and figuring out, when my next fix was,
Mm-hmm.
It would be all encompassing for me, unfortunately.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, let's dial back up to the story here. So you had this apartment with your fiance, and what happened?
Yeah. Oh gosh. So, well, I was in the room on the computer, looking at pornography. And my wife just happened to walk in or my fiance at the time walked in without being, without announcing that she was coming. And basically there I was. For all to see, for her to see, and that was enough. And it absolutely just blew up. She, of course, was just intensely hurt.
Sure.
I was her safe place. I was her protector. I was her, refuge, if you will. And now, completely the opposite. I had just, shot an arrow right into her heart, and that was interesting. I'd not seen the effects that this addiction would have on other people until that moment. And she threw the ring back at me. She threw 2 Bibles at me, told me that I just committed suicide, or excuse me, not suicide, thankfully. I
Right.
just committed adultery. And she walked out.
Hmm.
And I just remember sitting on the couch in our living room, so completely and utterly ashamed, um, at a loss. The way I describe it was I was falling into this deep abyss with nothing to grab hold of,
Hmm.
nothing solid to steady me in any way. It was a sharp pain, just aching, pain that feeling helpless.
Yeah.
I had just hurt her in one of the most intimate ways I possibly could, and I didn't know if she was going to come back. Um, Thankfully, about an hour or two later, she did come back. But then again, that was still, there was a lot of, oh my gosh, there was a lot of work, a lot of continued unpacking of the pain that I caused her.
Hmm.
But this was the interesting thing. So being involved in our church, again, having our faith in God, it
Hmm.
was the first time in my life where everything that I had hidden had been burst forth like a broken dam, right?
Right.
Everything exposed. I felt cut open, completely ashamed. Yet at the same time, simultaneously, I experienced the unconditional love of God through my church, through the people who were around us, who loved on us and took us in and mentored us and ministered to us. Um, Other men who found out about it and had struggled themselves and had found freedom and decided to take me under their wing and walk alongside of me. Um, that was absolutely life transforming. I had not ever experienced. I heard about the grace of God. Okay,
Right.
I'd never experienced it, at least not to that level. So I remember when people would talk about their faith, they talk about this freedom and joy and peace that they experience. And I actually remember thinking,
Hmm.
I mean, I'm a Christian. Why don't I feel those things? Well, this is part of the reason why, because I was hiding so much. I really, um, it hindered or handicapped me from experiencing the fullness of God's grace and goodness. And um, so anyway, that experience in my mind, looking back, was God pushing me into the light in a gracious way in order for me to experience His love, um, and in some ways for my wife as well. Um, but we both had to work through that together, and that was where I got plugged into a men's group. It's called CLC, which is the organization that I currently work for. You
Okay.
mentioned that I'm a relationship generator
Right.
for CLC, and so one of the first things that our pastor did was plug me into a group of men like that, and it was the first time that I remember ever experiencing community, a community of other men who were willing to be vulnerable, and
Hmm.
there was a safe enough environment to share those deepest, darkest parts of my heart that I was always ashamed of sharing before. And as I began to what I call walk in the light,
Hmm.
as opposed to walking in the darkness, which means just being truthful about who I am truly, um, and the weaknesses that I have, the character defects, whatever you want to call it. Um, when I'm truthful about those things, I actually experience God's grace afresh. And so, even speaking to you about this now, and every time I meet with a guy, because I've spent 20 years mentoring, um, working with men, and especially in a ministry context, where I will share this every single time, because most men are where I used to be in terms of being hiding in the dark, not being able to, or feeling the freedom to come out and reveal the things that they're ashamed of, because we're afraid of being incompetent.
Hmm.
We're afraid of being judged by others, and to be unworthy of love.
Right.
Um, but this was God's way in my life to teach me those things in a painful way, but I'm grateful
Right.
for it now.
So a lot of people don't realize, unless they've really studied it or they've been around it or situations where they've been near it, what an addictive thing pornography is. And they,
Yep.
I guess there are studies out there that I've seen headlines on this that, the claim that it is, and I believe it is as addictive as many of the cocaines and those heroines and
Yeah.
those types of drugs. Um,
Yeah,
you
definitely.
find yourself in a state of uncontrol. And so how long, when on your journey back, how long did it take you to get away from it? Or
Oh man,
break those cycles?
that's a great question. I would say, well, the trauma of that experience, I think fast forwarded it a little bit.
Okay.
But then, your motivation is very high, especially when you've been found out like that. And,
Yeah.
and then I would say a couple years later, fell in again and fell into struggle again. And then, learned that, that I wasn't going to be able to white knuckle it. I couldn't, it wasn't going to be based on my effort to overcome to overcome this addiction that I really needed, as they say in, a lot of, AA and NA and SA, these other addiction recovery programs. They say you've got to trust in a higher power, right? That ultimately the power, and this is going to be a little controversial. So some people, I don't know, we'll see. This is what I've experienced. The power was not in me. The power I found was in God, and what I call empowered me to break free of that addiction. But I had to discover that through a few other times of falling. I would say it was probably, and then, well, let me say this too. Then another piece to this is that, the addiction is kind of the weed that shows up in your garden. It's an outgrowth, but the roots can go deep, and the roots go back to our, family of origin, traumatic experiences we've had in our lives. And so it took 5 or 6 years to kind of start getting a grasp of how my upbringing in different ways affected who I was today, or then, the way that I was wounded in certain ways that caused me to want to search out, pornography, and to be to look for intimacy where it doesn't exist, because it's a false intimacy,
Yeah.
And so it took, I'd say 5 or 6 years to get a grasp on that. Now, I would say, between 6 and 10 years is probably where I think I experienced the more fullness of freedom, if you will. But this, and you'll hear, addicts say this in recovery. And there's some truth to this, but I want to delineate here for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll say, once an addict, always an addict. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
There's truth to that, in that I always have that potential, unfortunately, to go back to that. Okay. But thanks to what God has done for me, it doesn't define me anymore. Okay. And that's the key for me, is living in that truth of who God says I am, as being, as being good in his eyes, based on what he's done for me, versus what my sin or addiction claims that I am. Right. So in a sense, it's always there, but I don't live in that fear anymore, because I'm too convinced of God's goodness and how he's freed me from it now. Mm-hmm. That it's that addiction has, that's why I say, lost its power over me. Does that make sense?
Yeah. When you had that relapse, what were your emotions?
Yeah, it was really, the shame came flooding back in again. And so, and again, that was where the addiction, or the sin or character defect, if you will, or weakness that you face, was, in my case, was trying to define me again. Okay. And that just causes me incredible shame. So I would say shame number one. And that's part of the struggle, I guess, or it has been for me, is that battle between, okay, who I was before and who I am
Right.
now. Right.
Right.
And when you fall like that, it just, that old person, those old ways of thinking and managing those your struggles comes back and really starts battling again with who you are currently. And so, but here is the thing. So you can either, and this is where the cycle of addiction happens too often, where people will they're filled with shame and it pulls them back into the addiction, trying to seek out again, comfort or intimacy
Right.
or whatever it is,
Right.
which this continues to lead to more shame, etc. And but the beautiful thing about my wife is that she was a vessel of God's grace for me.
Okay.
So she had incredible grace for me, incredible love for me, in spite of, she had grown as well in that up to that point, and she knew that as time went on, she took it less personally.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the thing, is, as women, especially in marriages with men who are struggling like this, it can be intensely personal.
Yeah.
And I understand why. It's a very personal offense,
Sure.
But my wife,
because you're not just sinning against the Lord, you're sinning against that other, your spouse, right?
exactly. That's exactly right. And so she, in some sense, she was able to separate in her own growth, what was a result of my struggle, and it wasn't her fault, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing was too, for her, I think, and this played a role in me, was, and this is where God's grace comes in. I often, as a pastor, I would marry people.
Yeah.
I've married a lot of people, obviously, but
Right.
one things that I say is, your love for one another will not be enough for each other. And the reason I say that is because, at least in my experience from a Christian perspective, is that it's really the foundation of God's grace that that allows me to truly love my wife, and for her to love me in a selfless way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as we were struggling through this, as we get more and more acquainted with God's grace, we have more grace to offer each other as a result. And so that was hugely helpful in my recovery, to have her, come alongside of me and love me regardless of the pain I'd caused her. It also, again, when it was brought into the light again, it gave me another opportunity, whether it was through counseling, through a men's group of some sort, but to bring it out into the light and experience God's forgiveness again, experience my wife's forgiveness again. So, and that was that was transforming, and again, brought me further away, freed me further from the addiction.
Wow, what a blessing to have her and have her work with you in that manner. Because if you had been a single man, you still might be in that cycle.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that is, oh my gosh, let me just say, I do empathize with those men out there who are single and in a sense don't have that outlet.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole, I would want, I've met with guys like that and worked with guys like that. And you really got to take it on a case by case situation, but that struggle is real, especially now with everything kind of the sexualization of our culture and our world, from TV and internet and magazine stands, whatever, like just constantly coming at you. It's a challenge.
Well, that objectification and sex is used to sell just about everything.
Yeah.
You can't hide from it. It is brought to us in front of every type of media source from the time you're the smallest kid. So, so many things are sexualized. We have so much of it in the news these days, with all the what's going on with people's ideas of genders and sex and all these things. And there's a lot of, in my opinion, I mean, there's just a lot of people with a lot of time on their hands arguing over something I think that was solved thousands of years ago. So,
yeah, I would agree.
I mean, there's nothing progressive about misinformation. I mean, there just isn't.
Well said. That is really well said, Rex.
There
Wow.
just isn't. And so
Yeah.
I've been thinking about that concept a lot lately
Hmm.
because, every youthful generation wants to run around and think they're better than the previous generation. And we hope they are. We always hope they
Yeah.
are. But there's nothing more progressive. I mean, there's nothing more of a dichotomy than somebody who thinks they have a progressive but closed
Mhm.
mind, and
Yep.
that's just really the way it works. So anyway,
Definitely.
so one last question on the relapse situation.
Hmm.
Um, did you turn to your wife when this happened, or did she discover you again?
Yeah. That second time she discovered me
Okay.
because so again, I'm still at that point, I'm still white knuckling.
Okay.
And so and see there's that battle that happens, that tension between who God, the truth of who God says I am, that I'm
Yeah.
forgiven, I'm loved and accepted by him no matter what. Yet no, the old me saying, no, you're still defined by your sin. You need to hide.
Right.
You can't let anybody know about this. And so no, unfortunately she had to find me out. It took, and then it took time where, and here's where, again, this gets sensitive too. I think there, how do I say this for the men out there? There's certain things I think that we want to be transparent with our wives about. If you
Hmm.
fall like something like that, I think it's good to share that. Yes, this is where I fell, and to be honest about it and admit it. Um, there are other things too that in my experience, I've seen that aren't necessarily as beneficial or healthy for your wives to carry certain burdens, and that's where I think other men can come around you who can understand at a deeper level because they've experienced it themselves. Um, and I think that brotherhood was meant to help hold up the burden that we feel as men sometimes, that we
Hmm.
can't always share everything with our wives in that sense.
Right.
Um, but I will say the more here's what did help. Okay, and this
Okay.
is really oh man, this is hard for me. It was because, again, remember my mindset growing up as a kid was it's up to you. You got to take care of your own needs. But the big thing was being honest with my wife at the moment when I felt like, from a sexual perspective, that I had needs I needed met,
Yeah.
and I needed to be honest with her about that. I was prone not to go there because it puts you in a very vulnerable place,
Yes.
really vulnerable, and that is almost, for men, that is so hard
Right. No,
to be
no
able to
man
go
wants
there.
to be vulnerable. No.
No, right. But I will say that, so being honest with my wife, vulnerable with her about my needs, but actually drew us closer, and actually has caused her to be more empathetic to my needs and desirous to fulfill those needs, because she really does want to. Most women want to know your heart as a man.
Right.
They want to know you inside and out. And unfortunately, as men, we hold back. We don't want to reveal those things because of our fear of vulnerability.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a sign of weakness. Yeah.
exactly. But your wife wants to know you um, deeply, and when you're able to pull some of those things out, and share with her at a deeper emotional level, um, even at the level of saying, "Honey, I really need to be with you." Like, we need to be, um, man, did that help. And then as she met that need for me, it gave me confidence in knowing that, okay, I can ask, I
Yeah.
can go to her. That was huge.
That's what a blessing. What a blessing. So you took this strife, struggle, and the ability to overcome. What did you do with it? Did you build this into something? I mean, I know where we're headed, but yeah,
Yeah.
tell us what you did with this, overcoming the struggle.
Yeah. So one of the things was, obviously, I was a pastor for a while. Previous to that, I worked for another ministry called Young Life,
Yep.
where I got to work with teens, and enjoyed that a ton. But I think because of the experience that I had, um, I was able to bring a certain amount of authenticity to relationships,
Mm-hmm.
where I could let people in and be vulnerable about certain things that, earn trust and built relationships and partnerships and things to accomplish some amazing things for the Lord,
Yeah.
And so, and then just through that, I really developed a passion for men and their struggle, having been there myself and knowing what the unique issues we face. So as a pastor, I was specifically a men's pastor, as well as a couple other roles. And I got to work with men who were struggling in these issues a lot. And as I did, I started to realize some things that now, and I'll share this. I think you mentioned at the beginning that is starting to take the form of a book, an ebook that I'm creating right now. That by the way is going to be free, and at the end I can tell people where to get that, or if they want to email me so they can have access. But it's something I call empowered manhood.
Yep.
And the idea is basically that we as men, typically, because we have spent so much time isolated or in the dark, surrounded by a sea of shallow acquaintances and not any deeper connections, we're disempowered. And we're disempowered because we're trying to be self-sufficient.
Yeah.
It's a paradox, because our culture really tells us you need to get yourself together, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, wipe dirt on your wounds and move forward. And unfortunately, as a result, we've got a bunch of grown men who inside are still little boys.
Yeah.
Really just trying to act like men,
Right.
but unable to, because we haven't dealt with some of those deeper issues that we've struggled with. And in trying to be self-sufficient, we overlook those things. So the empowered man is the man who's actually come to the end of himself. The empowered man is the one who has woken up to the reality of the unmanageability of his own sin or weakness or issues that are going on in his life, and has instead put his trust in God and what God has done for him, in forgiving him for his sins and setting him free from those addictions. And then instead, the empowerment comes from a dependency on God. And again, this is paradoxical because we just don't think this way. We think total opposite. But this is kind of why when, from a Christian perspective, I think of when Jesus said in Matthew, the Beatitudes, he said, "Blessed are those who are poor in spirit."
Yep.
What his point was that we got to be honest with the fact that we are spiritually bankrupt and we need God. You know, as long as we continue to try to just do it ourselves, especially as men, man, eventually we're just gonna keep hitting the wall, and we're gonna unfortunately fail to live the lives I think we all desire to live, a life of integrity and a life that's my wife used to say, honey, how did she say it? I need you to protect my heart. That's what she said to me when we were dating. She said, I need you to protect my heart. And of course, now over time, that has taken on more substantial meaning. And as men, that's how we were made. We were made to be protectors, providers. And that doesn't mean I'm not saying that in a sexist way.
No,
where
I understand.
Women can't work or anything. Heck, no, that's not. In fact, yeah. Anyway, but we're meant to be that way, right? Yeah. Go ahead. You're gonna say something.
Well, that's men and women are built that way. Women, if you look at all the things that they need and desire most, it's security. And it's not just the physical security. It's everything. It's physical security, emotional security, those types. And again, that's not taking anything away from their capabilities or their skills or any of that kind of stuff. It's just the way we're built. And so,
unfortunately, though, when we haven't grown up emotionally and dealt with some of those woundedness, we're handicapped in being able to do those things.
Well,
we need healing.
There's an endless amount of work to be done in this space, just because I read this statistic years back. I don't even know if it's still the same, but at that time, it was 1 out of 6 clicks on the internet is pornography. And
not surprising.
The amount of traffic that it could be even higher today.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine what it might have been during the heat of the pandemic when things were down. And so it's it's volatile. It's a hidden monster. It's an 800-pound gorilla that exists in a lot of people's lives, and
Yeah.
it doesn't get the media attention. It's not funny enough, because the world likes to talk about sex and that sells and stuff, but it's not something that's talked about. Is how do people get over that? And unfortunately, what drives me bananas is I think that a lot of current culture, in Western culture, I'm not going to just call it the United States, has made it so that the use of pornography is just like, well, that's just expected behavior.
Yeah, yes. In fact, that was one of the things a woman said to my wife, and she said, Lisa, I think it's unrealistic for you to expect him to not engage in this. Like, this is
Yeah.
just what men do, and that was not helpful. That was
No,
not helpful.
no.
Yeah,
Just because everyone else is doing it doesn't make it right. Come on, and
exactly.
I, as a father of five, and especially with three daughters, I just cringe and get furious about any type of objectification of women, especially, but now it's of any sex. And I just have no tolerance for that kind of stuff. It's just, I just can't
Yeah.
see how you can ever, I don't care what anybody's beliefs are. How can you ever think that objectification of someone on any level like that is acceptable? I mean,
Right.
it's horrible. I mean, you might as well be physically beating someone. That's how bad. But when
Yeah.
you come to an objectification situation, you're not only objectifying and damaging that person, even though from a distance, it's your own,
Yeah.
damage that's being created. So I think it's amazing what you're up to and what you're doing. And now tell us a little bit about the ebook. When's it going to be available?
Yeah, so the ebook should be available in about a month. You can, if you're interested in it, you can go ahead and email me at mhatch@clchq.org.
Okay.
So yeah, so currently I'm finishing up that. I'm working for an organization, a men's ministry called CLC, which
Okay.
focuses laser focus on men's discipleship or growth spiritually would be another way of saying that. And so I get the opportunity, which I love. So I'm a national relationships generator. I get to build relationships with people all over the country, with pastors all over the country. I get to help them think through ways to provide opportunities for their men in their church to walk in, step in the light and to be empowered as opposed to disempowered. And so and I love doing that. And so we have certain curriculum that we offer churches to help in ministry to men, basically in their church.
Yeah.
And so I love getting a chance to meet with them, walk through the process of how to implement it in their church. It costs the church nothing, by the way.
Right.
And the beauty of my position, I can fly anywhere in the country, will not cost the church a dime, and can help them figure this out for themselves. Because here's the crazy statistic: 80% of churches have zero intentional opportunities for men. 80%.
Wow.
Now, I've done a lot of research on the internet, and you will see a lot of churches have many offerings for women.
Right.
And I think just naturally women are more social.
Yes.
And more willing to be vulnerable in some ways that guys are not.
Right.
And so it's more natural for women to kind of get together like that. But for men, it's rare that churches actually have opportunities for men. So I love being able to fill that need.
Well, that's awesome. What a great way to serve, and what a great way to help attack such an issue. I mean, again, this is such a massively underserved issue, and it destroys people's lives. It destroys people's families. It's terrible.
Yeah.
And it's a big lie that people think that they can, use it under control, because that's, it's like saying I can use crack under control or something. It doesn't,
Yep.
It doesn't work. So what's next? What's on the horizon next for you?
Oh man, yeah, that's a great question. So, well, in CLC, I'm focusing on the Pittsburgh region in terms of reaching out to churches. Although I'm open to anybody around the country. There's a church in Chicago that I'm currently talking to, for example. So there's that. I also have a podcast. You mentioned that I'm a podcast. I'm a podcaster on the side as well. Along with this, this lane of men and ministering to men in some ways, I also have this other lane that I run in with regard to economics and money and finance and investing.
Nice.
I have just a passion for folks who are out there, taking huge risks in some sense to provide value and be productive in our culture and community. And so this podcast is called Blue Collar Money: Theories of Middle Class Investing.
Okay.
And folks are willing to, obviously, we'd love for you to come check that out. And we like to say that we help everyday folks get financially unstuck by taking a blue collar approach, rolling up our sleeves, getting our hands dirty, and accepting responsibility for our own financial future. So,
gosh, I don't even want to open that can of worms of what's going on these days with the let's forgive people for their student loans. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, don't get me started either.
Sure. Well, then why don't you pay off my car loan? I got a mortgage. You want to take care of that for me too? Come on. So,
yeah.
Well, it's been great to have you on, Mike, today and tell your story. And thanks for being willing to be transparent on a very vulnerable issue. Not a whole lot of people can stand up because, addiction is widely recognized when it has to do with substances.
Yeah.
But, it's not as behavioral addictions are as addictive, as powerful. And they're just not something that gets as much, I don't know if it's airplay, respect, acknowledgement, but it just doesn't have the acceptance of, if I say, hey, I've had an addiction with alcohol, everybody's like, well, everybody's known somebody like that. But we're dealing with a situation that's mostly in the dark. So, appreciate you.
Exactly. Definitely. And
go ahead.
I was just going to say, if anybody wanted to reach out to me, I don't know if you're going to ask me this or not, but
that's where I was headed.
Okay, cool. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. Obviously clchq.org is the website for CLC. You can find me there. And I'm on Instagram if anyone wants to find me there. I also have a YouTube channel I have not done a whole lot with recently, but there are a lot of videos on there that kind of give you a feel of where I'm coming from. When go on YouTube, just Google YouTube it, I guess. Mike Hatch, and then Hashtags is the name of the show that I was doing. So it literally is a hashtag with HATCHTAGS. Okay. And you'll find me on YouTube as well.
Fantastic. Well, I got one last question for you before we wrap it up for this episode today. In the Western world, we have this, in Western cultures, we have this concept called a bucket list. And in fact, I have interviewed the bucket list guy, and his name is Trav Bell. He's down in Melbourne, Australia.
Wow.
Episode number 60. He's hilarious. It is an amazing, and it has mostly to do with living purposeful lives. Well, anyway, back to my question. So that's the list of things we want to do before our time is done here on Earth. Well, everything in the universe, there's an opposite. You know that, So where there's a heaven, there's a hell. Well, there's another list that's the opposite list of things we don't want to do or never want to do again. Now, that list rhymes with bucket, but starts with an F. But I'm not going to say that because it's a family show, right? Okay, so it's the F-it list, all right? So,
that's hilarious.
Yeah, now, people don't stop and think about this. They have them, but they don't really evaluate them that much. And so I'm going to ask you what might be an item or two that might be on your F-it list. Now, while you're thinking, because this is a left-handed question. I'll give you
it is. Right.
A couple examples. For me, a couple items would be there. I'm not going to have a collection of pet snakes. Not going to happen. Caviar and sardines. Nope. Don't need to do that again. And the one that's probably the biggest, which was very traumatic, and I did an episode on this, is I will never, ever again do a Lakota Sioux sweat lodge. The concept of excessive heat, excessive humidity, excessive drumming, and excessive chanting, and a slice of nudity all at the same time. It was almost insufferable.
That is insane.
So Dakota Sweat Lodge, no. So what might be an item or two that might be on Mike's F-it list?
I really appreciate you giving me those examples. That was helpful. First of all, this is a thing, okay? You might not believe this or not, but there's a thing with your chromosomes that affect how cilantro tastes.
Yes.
I don't know if anybody knows this, but so I am one of those few, I think it's 1% of the population. I don't know. Cilantro tastes like soap, and I pick up the littlest, tiniest fragment of cilantro in anything, and it just makes me want to puke. In fact, I go to restaurants now and I'll say, especially if it's a Mexican restaurant, I said, no cilantro, please, unless you want me frothing at the mouth, rolling around on the floor because I'm highly allergic. I'm not technically allergic, but they definitely remember, and not to bring it.
Yeah.
So that would be one thing. The second thing is, I'm feeling a little vulnerable by this in a sense because it's not as manly. Unfortunately, I will probably not ride roller coasters anymore or anything that spins. I have an incredibly weak stomach and unfortunately some inner ear issues I think maybe came along with being in the
right there with you.
Air Force. Yep. Oh my gosh, man. I've lost it too many times trying to push it.
Yep.
So
I can tell you of many times I tried to convince myself that I could make it through the day at an amusement park with my kids. And if I wanted to ruin the entire experience, go do something that's spun right first out of the gate.
Ugh. Oh, dude. Yeah. Terrible.
Terrible. And I can't even ride in a car in a passenger seat.
Yep.
Unless I've got a window open and I'm, I can't, if I were to read something, look at my phone. No, sorry. I'm a mess. I'm
very similar. The highway, when you're just going straight for a while, that's the only way I can kind of take riding the passenger seat. Otherwise it's got to be real brief. I'm the same way. Yep. That's
crazy. Well, it's been great to meet you, Mike. Look forward to, we're probably going to reach out and get you back on the show once your ebook is out. Talk about that. Yeah, some more progress of what you're up to as being a relationship generator and all the work you're doing. I applaud you. I think you're doing great things because I just know, being a man, I know how much of the pornography is out there, what the addiction level is, and I know how gripping it can be on people.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Rex, for having me on, man.
It's been a great time. Thanks for tuning in, folks. We'll call this an episode. Do not forget to stop by Mike's podcast and also a website to get in touch with him. You can find him on LinkedIn and Instagram. Please stop by the show websites. We'll have all of his links there. So all you have to do is go to the search bar and search his name, and you'll be able to find his page on the website. So until next time, we ask you to do these 3 things. A little bit influenced by the pandemic, and hopefully I'll be able to stop saying the first one is be safe, but be bold and make it a great day.